The night was darker than pitch, the kind of darkness that swallowed sound and sense. No stars graced the heavens, nor did the moon cast its silver glow, just smoke, thick, choking smoke, and flames licking at the black sky, turning the Kane homestead into a pyre. Wood cracked and splintered, collapsing under the ferocious blaze. Heat rolled across the ground, scorching the dirt and searing flesh. Silas Kane stumbled through the chaos, heart pounding in his ears louder than the inferno consuming his world. His boots crunched over shattered glass and smoldering debris. "Caleb!" His voice was raw, breaking with desperation. Ash swirled, clinging to his sweat-slick skin. He found his brother near the back porch, sprawled amid the wreckage, a crimson stain spreading across his shirt. Caleb's voice was barely a rasp, his face smeared with soot and blood, his pale blue eyes, so much like Silas's, fluttered. "Hold on, brother. Just hold on." Silas dropped to his knees, arms wrapping under Caleb's shoulders, dragging him away from the collapsing beams. Firelight painted their faces in flickering oranges and reds, and every breath Silas took seared his lungs. Caleb coughed, blood bubbling at the corner of his lips. They came out of nowhere. His fingers, trembling, clutched at Silas's coat. "Mercer," heard one of them say Mercer's name. "Elias Mercer." The name struck Silas like a hammer to the chest. The land baron, always circling like a buzzard trying to buy them out. Silas's jaw clenched, rage thick and hot mingling with grief. "Don't talk, Caleb. Save your strength." His voice cracked, betraying the calm he tried to hold. But Caleb gave a faint, rueful smile. "Ain't no strength left. I just wanted to see the stars again." His gaze drifted skyward where smoke blotted out the night. Tell her His words broke off. His chest stilled. Silas froze, heart shattering in slow, painful beats. "No. Caleb, no. Don't." But the stillness in his brother's face said enough. His brother, his blood, was gone. For a long moment Silas knelt there, holding him, the fire crackling around them like a funeral choir. Tears carved tracks through the grime on his face. Then, gently, he eased Caleb down, his hand lingering on the bloodied handkerchief Caleb had carried, the one their mother embroidered when they were boys. Fingers curling around it, Silas pressed the cloth to his lips. "I swear," he whispered into the smoky void, voice low and fierce, "on your blood and mine, I'll make him pay." Behind him the homestead groaned, timbers surrendering to flame. Everything, his family, his past, reduced to ashes. Silas stood, boots planting into scorched earth, eyes like steel, heart a forge of vengeance. Somewhere in the distance a horse whinnied. He turned toward the sound, muscles aching but purpose clear. Mercer had taken everything, and Silas Kane would take something back, if it was the last thing he did. The world blurred to the relentless beat of hooves pounding across barren plains. Dust plumed behind Silas's horse. The horizon stretched, his silhouette a lone rider beneath a vast sky now sprinkled with distant stars, cut a path through the darkness. Vengeance was a bitter trail, but it was the only one he had left. Chapter 1. Dustwood's Stranger. Dustwood wasn't much to look at, a cluster of buildings huddled together along a dirt road, weathered and sun-bleached, as if they'd given up fighting the relentless heat and grit of the frontier. The wind carried the scent of horses, dust, and the faintest hint of whiskey, a cocktail of smells that clung to every western town Silas Kane had passed through. Yet something about Dustwood felt heavier, like the air itself held secrets and sins best left buried. Silas rode in slow, the hooves of his bay mare kicking up small clouds of powdery dust with every measured step. He shifted in the saddle, his coat fluttering slightly with the wind. The worn leather of his duster was stained from countless miles and rainstorms, and the wide-brimmed hat cast a shadow over his face, hiding the steel pew eyes that missed nothing. One hand rested casually near the revolver on his hip, fingers twitching just enough to discourage anyone foolish enough to test him. Heads turned, conversations paused, A shopkeeper wiping down a crate froze mid-swipe, gaze darting from Silas's boots to the gun at his side. Children playing with a stick and hoop scampered behind their mother's skirts. Even the old hound sleeping on the boardwalk lifted its head, let out a soft whine, and decided feigned sleep was safer. "Who's that?" a woman whispered from the mercantile doorway. Her bonnet shielded most of her face, but her curious gaze lingered on the stranger. "Trouble," came a gruff reply from a grizzled man leaning against a post, pipe dangling from the corner of his mouth. "Ain't no man rides in looking like that unless he's got a score to settle." Silas ignored the stares. He'd long since stopped caring about the gossip that followed a man like him. Dustwood was like every other town, too small to mind its business, too curious for its own good. Ahead loomed the saloon, the dusty spur. Its sign creaked on rusted chains, and the warped doors swung open as two ranch hands stumbled out, laughter echoing. Whiskey, cheap perfume, and sweat poured from the entrance in waves, along with the faint, discordant notes of a piano player who clearly favored whiskey over rhythm. Silas dismounted, boots thudding against the packed earth. He gave the mare's flank a reassuring pat and tied her to the hitching post, his movements slow, deliberate. The jingle of spurs followed him up the steps. He paused at the doors, gaze sweeping the street one last time, old habit never broken, before pushing through. Inside, smoke curled thick and lazy toward the ceiling. Card tables crowded the floor. Men hunched over worn decks and piles of tarnished coins. Laughter punctuated by curses filled the air. Behind the bar, a plump man polished a glass that never seemed to get clean. Silas's boots echoed on the warped floorboards as he moved toward the bar, conversations dipping into wary murmurs at his approach. He caught snippets of, "Don't look at him, must be bounty trouble," and "Lord, look at them eyes, cold as a snake." He let the words roll off him like rain off oilskin. "Whiskey?" he said when he reached the bar. His voice, low and gravelly, pulled the bartender's attention fast. "Comin' right up." The barkeep set a glass down, amber liquid sloshing just shy of the rim. Silas nodded in thanks, lifted it, and let the burn settle in his chest. That's when he heard it. A table to his left, 3 men, rough-looking, with dust-caked boots and calloused hands, talking low but not nearly careful enough. "Mercer's got the whole town by the short hairs," one grumbled, tapping ash from a cigar. "Bought out the Patterson ranch last week. Ain't right." "Not just Patterson," another said, eyes darting around before he leaned in. "He's got somethin' bigger planned, railroad deal or so I heard. Anyone don't sell, well, accidents happen." Silas's jaw tightened. Mercer, always Mercer. Like a weed that wouldn't die no matter how deep you cut the roots. "Heard tell someone's riding after him," the third man murmured, his voice dropping. "Some drifter looking for blood." Silas took another sip of whiskey, gaze fixed on the swirling amber in his glass. Not a drifter, he thought. Just a man settling a debt. The piano stumbled into a raucous tune, but the notes barely registered. His world narrowed. Mercer's name echoing like a bell tolling in his ears, a reminder of burning wood, his brother's dying breath, and the promise he'd made under a sky choked with smoke. He set the glass down with a quiet thunk, leather creaking as he straightened. He didn't need the rest of the conversation. Mercer was close, and that meant Silas was closer to what he'd come for. Outside, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the street. Dustwood whispered and watched as the stranger finished his drink, adjusted his hat, and stepped back into the fading light. Eyes sharp, purpose burning hot beneath that cold exterior. Vengeance was a patient thing, and Silas Kane had waited long enough. The saloon buzzed with the restless energy of men who worked hard and drank harder. Silas stood at the bar, the whiskey's warmth burning down to his bones, but his mind stayed cold and sharp. The conversation he'd overheard about Mercer echoed in his head like the steady toll of a church bell before a funeral. His funeral, or Mercer's, remained to be seen. Behind him, boots scraped against the floor, a harsh sound in the din. He caught movement in the bar's cloudy mirror, a trio of men peeling away from their table, shoulders squared with the kind of swagger that spoke of bad intentions. Mercer's men. He'd bet his last bullet on it. "Hey," one drawled, a hulking brute with a pockmarked face and a grin that held no warmth. "Heard you been asking questions that ain't none of your business." Silas didn't turn right away. He finished his drink, set the glass down with careful deliberation, then pivoted to face them. His gaze swept over the trio. 3 against 1, typical. "Maybe I just don't like the answers I'm getting," Silas said, voice low and smooth, like whiskey aged long and sharp enough to cut. The man's grin twisted. "Well, ain't that a shame?" His hand shot out, aiming to shove Silas's chest. Big mistake. Silas moved quick as a striking snake, caught the man's wrist, twisted, and sent him crashing into a table. Cards flew like startled birds, and a poker game scattered in curses and clattering chairs. The saloon erupted. Patrons scrambled back, giving the brawl space like it was a show they didn't want front-row seats to. Silas barely sidestepped a punch from the second thug, landing a solid fist into the man's gut. The third swung a bottle glass shattered against Silas's shoulder, the sting sharp, but he powered through it. He ducked, drove his elbow into the man's ribs, and turned just in time to catch the first brute charging back, fist like a hammer aimed for Silas's jaw. The punch connected, white-hot pain blooming across his face. Blood filled his mouth with a copper tang, but he didn't falter. Rage, cold, honed, pushed him forward. Fists flew, wood splintered as bodies crashed into furniture. Someone shouted, "Deputy ain't gonna stand for this," but no lawman appeared. Not yet. Silas grappled with the biggest thug, knocking over chairs and patrons in a mess of boots and flailing limbs. He landed a punch square in the man's face, but missed the glint of steel flashing to his left. Pain exploded in his side, a hot, searing burn. His breath hitched. Knife. Damn. Warmth spread under his coat, wet and wrong. Another blow sent him reeling. Hands grabbed his jacket, dragged him toward the saloon doors. His vision blurred, but he fought, legs kicking out, landing a hit that sent one man staggering. It wasn't enough. With a heave, they threw him out. The doors swung wildly, and Silas crashed onto the dirt street, breath knocked clean out of him. He tasted dust, felt blood soaking through his shirt. "Stay down, Kane," one of them spat from above. "Mercer don't like folks poking their noses where they don't belong." Bootsteps retreated. Laughter followed. Silas tried to push up. The world spun. His side throbbed in time with his heartbeat, a frantic, pulsing drum. Darkness edged his vision. He grit his teeth, forcing air into burning lungs, but the ground felt like it wanted to swallow him whole. He didn't know if he was cursing or praying when blackness finally claimed him. Rebecca Whitfield's steps quickened as she made her way down Dustwood's main street. Her skirts gathered dust at the hem, the fading light casting long shadows against the buildings. She'd heard the commotion at the saloon, who hadn't? Trouble seemed to come easy to this town lately, and it settled heavy in her chest. Then she saw him, a man, bloodied, crumpled in the dirt like discarded laundry, blood soaked through his shirt, glistening dark under the growing twilight. "Oh, dear Lord!" Her breath hitched, feet carrying her forward before caution could voice an objection. She knelt beside him, hands gentle but sure. His face, beneath the bruises and blood, was rugged, jaw shadowed with dark stubble. His hat lay nearby, dust caked along the brim. "Sir?" She shook his shoulder lightly. No response. His pulse fluttered beneath her fingertips, faint but stubborn. Behind her, voices rose. "Leave him be, Miss Whitfield," someone called. Old Tom, the blacksmith, stood a few yards away, wiping grimy hands on his apron. "Ain't it trouble?" "He's bleeding," she snapped without looking back. "Would you have me let him die here like a dog in the street?" "He brought it on himself," another chimed in. "Riled up Mercer's men. Best thing for us if he don't wake up." Rebecca bit back a sharp retort, focusing instead on the man before her. His lashes, dark and thick, fluttered as he stirred, a pained groan escaping his lips. "Hush now," she soothed. "I've got you." Using all the strength her slender frame could muster, she slid an arm under his shoulders, lifting. He hissed in pain, trying to push her away. "Don't need help," he rasped. "You most certainly do," she countered, gritting her teeth as she half-dragged, half-coaxed him to his feet. His weight was solid muscle and deadweight exhaustion. "Let me do my job, sir, or you'll bleed out before morning." He tried to protest again, but faltered, knees buckling. "Stubborn fool," she muttered, looping his arm over her shoulder. Her clinic wasn't far, a modest building with whitewashed walls, blessedly close to the saloon. Step by agonizing step, they reached the porch. He collapsed onto the cot inside, boots thudding against the floorboards. Rebecca wasted no time. Lantern light flickered as she lit it, golden glow spilling over rough-hewn shelves lined with jars and bandages. She fetched water, clean cloths, and her sewing kit. He was already trying to sit up again. I said, hush, she cut in, tone broking no argument. Her hands, though gentle, pressed him firmly back. "You've a knife wound, bruised ribs, and more bleeding than I care for. You want to argue? Do it after you're not dying on my floor." His lips quirked. A hint of sardonic amusement, but he relented, chest rising in shallow breaths. As she peeled back his coat and blood-soaked shirt, her heart clenched at the angry gash marring his side. "Mercer," he muttered, barely above a breath. Her hands faltered. "Mercer, of course. Trouble wasn't just passing through. Trouble had a name. And now it's lying on my table," she thought grimly. She dipped the cloth into the basin, wrung it out, and began cleaning the wound, her face bathed in the warm glow of the lantern. Outside, the town settled into night. But inside her clinic, the battle against darkness, against death, raged on, and Rebecca Whitfield, healer and pacifist, refused to lose this fight. Silas woke to the faint scent of lavender and antiseptic, a strange combination that tugged at the edges of his consciousness. His body felt like it had been trampled by a herd of wild mustangs, every muscle throbbing, ribs aching with each shallow breath. He tried to move, but found a weight pressing him down. Not heavy, just firm, like the insistence of someone who wouldn't be ignored. His eyes cracked open against the persistent haze, and the first thing he saw was a warm amber glow flickering against wooden walls. A lantern burned low on a shelf, casting soft shadows that danced across jars filled with strange herbs and tinctures. Then he saw her. A woman sat beside him, face framed by chestnut hair pulled into a neat bun, with a few rebellious strands curling at her temple. Her sleeves were rolled to her elbows, revealing slender arms smudged with dried blood. His blood, he realized grimly. Her hazel eyes were focused, brows knit in concentration as she dabbed at the bandage wrapped around his side. "Easy," she murmured without looking up. "That wound won't close if you keep squirming." Silas's gaze narrowed. "Who?" His voice came out rough, like gravel scraping against stone. He cleared his throat and tried again. "Who are you?" "Rebecca Whitfield," she replied, gently securing the bandage with nimble fingers. "You're lucky I found you when I did. Another few minutes and you'd have bled out on that street," he grimaced, forcing himself onto an elbow despite the searing protest of his body. "Didn't ask for your help." Her eyes finally met his, and for a moment he was caught off guard. They were kind, damnably kind. But there was steel beneath the warmth, like sunlit water with rocks hidden just below the surface. "You didn't have to," she said, voice calm but firm. "A man bleeding to death in the dirt doesn't need to ask." Silas let out a short, humorless laugh that pulled at his stitches. Pain flared, sharp enough to make him grit his teeth. "You got a habit of dragging half-dead strangers into your place? Only the ones foolish enough to pick fights they can't win." The jab landed and his gaze darkened. "Wasn't a fight I started, but you finished it well enough," she countered, "or tried to." She reached for a fresh cloth, dipping it into a basin of water before wiping away the sweat beading his brow. Her touch was gentle, careful, which irritated him more than it should. Kindness made things complicated. He didn't have room for complicated. "Look, lady," he muttered, "I didn't come here for a sermon." "And I didn't plan on giving one," she shot back, "but you charge into a saloon like a storm looking to tear through a town and you think no one's going to get caught in the mess? People have enough trouble around here without you adding to it." Silas's jaw clenched. His head throbbed, pain and exhaustion making his temper simmer closer to the surface. "You got no idea what kind of trouble I'm dealing with." "Maybe not," Rebecca conceded, rinsing the cloth and wringing it out. "But I know bitterness when I see it. Carrying that weight around will eat you alive." "Spare me the lectures," he growled, pushing her hand away. "Violence is the only thing some men understand." Folks like Mercer. His voice cut off, sharp and bitter, the name tasting like ash on his tongue. Her expression softened, but her gaze never wavered. Violence might get you what you want in the short run, but it won't bring you peace. Peace? He laughed again, the sound low and rough. Lady, that ain't what I'm after. Silas swung his legs over the side of the cot, ignoring the flare of pain that shot through him. His head spun, vision swimming, but damned if he'd lie there and be lectured like a wayward child. He started to stand, too fast, his knees buckling. Rebecca caught him before he hit the floor. Stubborn fool, she muttered under her breath, half dragging him back onto the cot. He was heavier than he looked, all lean muscle and dead-weight exhaustion, but she managed with a surprising strength born of necessity. Let me go, he ground out. Not until you stop acting like an idiot, she snapped. You think you're proving something, but all you're doing is bleeding all over my floor. Silas clenched his jaw, breathing hard through his nose. He hated feeling weak, hated needing anyone. But the fire in her voice and the firm set of her jaw disarmed him more than any drawn gun could have. He sagged back onto the cot, chest heaving. Why are you doing this? His voice was quieter now, less bite, more bewilderment. Rebecca paused, the anger in her posture easing. She reached out, brushing a lock of damp hair from his forehead with gentle fingers. Because someone has to care. And you've got enough wounds for a dozen men, most of them deeper than that knife cut. Silas closed his eyes, exhaustion dragging at him like an undertow. Her touch, soft and warm, stirred something he wasn't ready to name. Outside, the night deepened, darkness settling over Dustwood like a heavy blanket. Inside the small clinic, the lantern's golden glow flickered, casting long, soft shadows across rough-hewn walls and two souls caught in the crossfire of fate, one hardened by vengeance, the other softened by compassion. And neither knew just how entwined their paths had become. The small clinic smelled of lavender soap, liniment, and something warm and inviting that Silas hadn't expected. Stew, if his nose wasn't lying to him. His stomach, traitorous thing, gave a low growl that echoed embarrassingly loud in the otherwise quiet room. Rebecca Whitfield, her skirts swishing softly as she moved, returned from the back carrying a worn wooden tray. On it sat a bowl steaming with rich, savory broth and a hunk of fresh bread beside it. She set it down on the small table next to his cot, wiping her hands on her apron with that same matter-of-fact grace she seemed to carry like a second skin. Eat, she said simply. Your body's been through enough without adding starvation to the list. Silas eyed the bowl warily, torn between stubborn pride and the undeniable pull of hunger gnawing at him. His gaze shifted from the stew to her, noting the faint smudge of flour on her cheek, likely from baking the bread herself. She must have caught the hesitation in his eyes because she quirked an eyebrow, lips twitching into the faintest suggestion of a smile. It's not poisoned, she teased. I'd hardly go through all the trouble of patching you up just to finish you off with supper. He snorted, a sound that could almost pass for amusement, then muttered. Wouldn't blame you if you did. Still his hand reached for the spoon, fingers curling around the handle. The first sip was a revelation, rich with tender chunks of beef, potatoes soft enough to melt on his tongue, seasoned with herbs he couldn't name but appreciated all the same. Rebecca watched him with a quiet satisfaction before moving to straighten a pile of folded linens on a nearby shelf. Folks in town pitch in with supplies when they can, she said, nodding toward the assortment of jars, salves, and handmade quilts neatly stacked around the room. Mrs. Hargrove sews the quilts, claims it's therapeutic for her arthritis, and the Johnson boys bring firewood after their school lessons, when they're not causing trouble, that is. Silas glanced around as he ate, really taking in the space for the first time. The clinic was small but homey, walls lined with shelves holding glass jars of dried herbs and worn medical books. The quilts, vibrant with mismatched patches, brought unexpected warmth to the place, softening the edges of what could have been a cold clinical environment. Everything spoke of effort, of care stitched into every corner. You run this place all by yourself? He asked between bites, voice rough but laced with something that wasn't quite skepticism, curiosity maybe. Rebecca nodded, smoothing out a blanket with practiced hands. Dustwood's got no doctor. Closest one's 2 towns over, and not everyone can afford the trip. Folks around here need someone." Her gaze drifted back to him, soft but steady. People deserve help when they're hurt, no matter who they are. That pricked at something inside him, something that hadn't been touched in a long while. Kindness like that. It was dangerous. Made a man forget the world could chew you up and spit you out just as quick. "You always take in strays," he grumbled, though the words lacked heat. Her smile widened just a fraction. "Only the grumpy ones." He huffed out a laugh before he could catch himself, shaking his head. "You're something else, lady." "Rebecca," she corrected gently, settling into the chair beside him. "Not lady, just Rebecca." Silas nodded, finishing off the stew and wiping his mouth with the back of his hand before remembering himself and reaching for the linen she'd thoughtfully placed nearby. He wasn't raised in a barn, though life lately had a way of making him forget simple courtesies. Silence settled between them, not uncomfortable but thick with unspoken thoughts. Outside, the evening deepened, the faint hum of cicadas underscoring the quiet. Rebecca stood to collect the empty bowl, fingers brushing his for the briefest moment, a spark of warmth he wasn't ready to acknowledge. "Thank you," he said finally, voice rougher for the rarity of the words. Rebecca paused, offering a small nod. "You're welcome." Her gaze softened. "And for what it's worth, not everyone's out to hurt you, Silas." He looked away, out the window, jaw tightening against the weight of that truth, or the lie of it. His past said otherwise. Outside, dust swirled in the fading light, painting the world in muted golds and dusky blues. Movement caught his eye, a rider approaching, horse kicking up dirt in a slow but purposeful trot. Silas's gaze narrowed as recognition settled in his gut. Caleb Hero. "Well," he muttered, pushing himself upright despite Rebecca's protesting glance. "Looks like the past just came knocking." Rebecca followed his gaze, expression unreadable as Caleb drew closer, his deputy's badge glinting in the twilight. Outside, the town of Dustwood held its breath. Inside, old ghosts stirred. Chapter 2. Ghosts of the Past. The rhythmic thud of hooves grew louder, sending small clouds of dust swirling across the street as Caleb Harrow reined in his chestnut gelding outside the clinic. The fading twilight stretched long shadows over Dustwood, the amber glow of lanterns flickering to life in doorways and windows. Inside, Silas watched through the glass, the tension in his shoulders winding tight. Caleb swung off his horse with the ease of a man born in a saddle, his spurs clinking softly against the worn wooden boards as he climbed the clinic steps. His hand hovered at his belt, not quite reaching for his holster, but close enough to make a statement. Silas recognized that stance. Hell, he knew it too well. Caleb wasn't just coming as an old friend. He was coming as the law. The door creaked open, letting in a waft of evening air tinged with dust and the faint scent of horses. Caleb stepped inside, his gaze sweeping the room before settling on Silas. Brown eyes, sharp as ever, locked onto him with a weight that dragged old memories to the surface. Memories Silas had tried to bury beneath layers of time and bitterness. "You shouldn't have come back," Caleb said finally, voice low and steady. Silas leaned back against the cot, arms crossing over his chest. The movement tugged at the fresh stitches in his side, but he didn't flinch. He wasn't about to give Caleb that satisfaction. "Good to see you too, Harrow," he drawled. Rebecca, standing by the shelves arranging jars, glanced between them. Her lips pressed into a thin line, sensing the undercurrent of tension thickening the room. Caleb ignored the quip, gaze hardening. "What the hell are you thinking, Silas? Coming into town? Stirring up trouble like you're looking to get yourself killed?" "Didn't know Dustwood rolled out the welcome wagon," Silas shot back. "But thanks for the concern." Caleb let out a breath, rubbing the back of his neck. "Damn it, Silas, this isn't a joke. Mercer's got half this town in his pocket. You think taking him on is going to end any way but bad?" "That's so." Silas's voice dropped, colder now, from under us. "Got my brother killed. And you're standing here telling me to let it go?" Rebecca's breath caught, but she said nothing, her gaze dropping to the floor. Caleb's jaw tightened. "That's not what I'm saying, and you know it. But this, coming in guns blazing, it's a fool's errand. Mercer ain't just some rancher with money. He's got men, lots of 'em. Sheriff's turning a blind eye, and folks are too scared to stand up. You push, you're liable to bring more hurt down on yourself and everyone else." Silas shook his head, bitterness curling in his gut. "Didn't peg you for a coward, Caleb." A flash of anger sparked in Caleb's eyes. "Don't you put that on me. I stayed here when you ran off, Silas. I stayed and tried to do what I could for this town. Ain't my fault the world don't play fair." Silence stretched between them, thick with old wounds that time hadn't healed. Once they'd been boys, racing horses through these same dusty streets, sharing secrets and dreams under starlit skies. Now they stood on opposite sides of a chasm neither seemed able to cross. Rebecca finally broke the tension, stepping forward. "This isn't helping either of you," she said gently but firmly. "Anger won't fix what's broken." Caleb sighed, shoulders sagging. "Look, I get why you're angry, Silas. I do. But you taking on Mercer alone, it's suicide." Silas's gaze darkened, steel in every word. "I didn't come here looking for help, Caleb. I came to settle a debt." Caleb studied him for a long moment, something like regret flickering in his eyes. "I remember when you used to smile," he said quietly. "Used to think there was good in the world worth fighting for." Silas's lips twisted into something that wasn't quite a smile. Too sharp, too tired. "World's got a way of beating that out of a man." Without another word, Caleb turned on his heel, boots echoing against the wooden floor as he headed for the door. He paused on the threshold, glancing back one last time. "Just be careful, Silas. Not everyone's as lucky to walk away twice." The door creaked shut behind him, leaving a heavy silence in his wake. Silas stared at the closed door, jaw clenched tight enough to ache. Rebecca's soft voice broke the quiet. "He's worried about you. Should worry about himself," Silas muttered, pushing off the cot. Pain flared in his side, but he welcomed it. It kept him focused, kept the ghosts at bay. Outside, Caleb mounted his horse, casting one last glance toward the clinic before riding off into the night. Inside, Silas stood by the window, watching his oldest friend disappear down the darkened street. Some ghosts, it seemed, never stayed buried. The clinic door shut with a soft click, and for a long stretch of silence, Silas remained by the window, staring at the swirling dust left in Caleb's wake. His gaze traced the horizon, where darkness crept steadily, pulling shadows over the town like a blanket. He let out a breath, slow and heavy, muscles tight with frustration. Behind him, the quiet was broken only by the soft rustle of fabric and the faint clinking of glass as Rebecca busied herself rearranging supplies on the shelf. Though it was plain she wasn't focused, her movements were too precise, too deliberate. Silas finally turned from the window, raking a hand through his hair. "So," he drawled, voice rougher than he intended, "you and Caleb." Rebecca's hand stilled over a jar of salve. Her shoulders stiffened before she set it down carefully, as if gathering her thoughts. "What about me and Caleb?" "Didn't think I needed to spell it out," Silas replied, arms folding across his chest. His gaze stayed fixed on her, studying the tension in her posture, the slight flush that crept up her neck. "Man looked at you like he was holding back a whole hell of a lot." Her lips pressed into a thin line. "It was a long time ago," she said finally. "We were young, foolish." He huffed out a breath, the kind that wasn't quite a laugh. "Seems like there's more to it than just young and foolish." Rebecca turned then, facing him fully. Her gaze was steady, but there was something guarded in her expression, like she was holding a door closed against a storm. "Caleb and I were engaged," she admitted quietly. "Years ago, before the war changed everything." Silas's jaw tightened. Engaged. That word sat heavier in his chest than it had any right to. "Guess that explains the look he gave me," he muttered. "Like I was trespassing on something that ain't mine to step into." Rebecca's eyes flashed, indignation sparking. "This isn't about you," she snapped. "And it's not about Caleb either, not anymore. Could have fooled me." His words came out sharper than he intended, but something about the revelation, about the history between them, gnawed at him in a way he didn't understand. Or maybe didn't want to. Rebecca drew in a breath, steadying herself. "We thought we wanted the same things. Marriage, a family. But life has a way of showing you what you're really made of. Her gaze drifted toward the window, toward the street Caleb had disappeared down. When my father passed and I chose to stay here, Caleb had other plans. He wanted to move west, chase opportunities. I couldn't leave Dustwood, not when people here needed me. Silas studied her for a long moment, the fire in her gaze mixing with something softer, regret, maybe, or just the weight of choices that couldn't be undone. "And him?" he asked. "He let you go easy?" A faint, bittersweet smile touched her lips. "Nothing about it was easy." Silas looked away, jaw working. Part of him wanted to press further, to dig into the details he had no business caring about, but another part, the wiser, wearier part, told him to let it lie. Caleb Harrow was her past. What she did with that past wasn't his concern, and yet it stuck with him. The way her voice softened when she spoke of what could have been, the way her gaze lingered on empty streets. Rebecca sighed, rubbing her temple. "Look, Silas, whatever you think this is, it's not complicated. Caleb and I, we made our choices. They just didn't lead us to the same place." Her gaze met his again, clear and unwavering. "The past is the past." He wanted to believe that. Hell, he wanted to believe it didn't matter one way or another. But feelings, real ones, had a way of creeping in when you least expected them, tangling things up in ways that had nothing to do with reason. "Yeah," he said finally, voice low. "Past has a funny way of sticking around, though." Rebecca opened her mouth to reply, but he was already turning toward the door, needing air, space, anything to clear the mess in his head. "Silas," she started, but he shook his head. "Thanks for the stew," he muttered, hand resting on the doorframe, "and for patching me up, but I gotta clear my head." With that, he stepped out into the cooling evening. Outside, the sky stretched wide and endless, streaked with the deep crimson of a blood-red sunset. Clouds, heavy and bruised with twilight, rolled along the horizon. Silas shoved his hands into his coat pockets, boots scuffing against the dirt as he walked aimlessly down the road. His thoughts churned, of Caleb, of Rebecca, of the simmering tangle of loyalty and bitterness twisting in his gut. Revenge had been simple once, black and white, Mercer's blood for his brothers, justice in the shape of a bullet. But now things felt muddy, complicated. He paused at the edge of town, the vast open plains yawning before him, bathed in that fiery, dying light. The wind stirred, carrying the faint scent of sagebrush and dust. Silas closed his eyes, letting the breeze wash over him. Revenge was still there, burning in his chest. But so was something else, something that felt a hell of a lot like doubt. And that scared him more than any gun pointed at his back. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the world was painted in deep purples and smoldering reds. Silas stood alone beneath the vast sky, torn between the weight of his past and the unexpected pull of something he wasn't sure he deserved. Dustwood slumbered under the hazy warmth of a late afternoon, the kind where heat shimmered off rooftops and dust motes drifted lazily through shafts of golden sunlight. The streets, usually quiet at this hour, bustled with townsfolk wrapping up their day. Women gathering groceries, children darting between storefronts, and old men nursing whiskeys on the saloon porch. Silas stood at the edge of town, boots planted in dry dirt, arms crossed over his chest as he watched the world move around him. His mind churned with restless thoughts, the weight of old grudges and new complications tightening his jaw. The sky overhead, a brilliant stretch of blue, promised nothing but heat and trouble came fast. It started with the distant thunder of hooves, faint at first, like the earth's heartbeat quickening, then louder, too many horses for it to be a passing group of cowhands. Silas's gaze sharpened, scanning the horizon just as a dust cloud swelled beyond the ridge. His stomach twisted with grim recognition. Rebecca's voice called out nearby, soft but questioning. "What is it?" He didn't answer right away, muscles coiling as tension gripped him. "Get inside," he muttered, already moving toward the street. Seconds later, the bandits crested the hill. 8, maybe 10 of them, faces masked with kerchiefs, guns drawn, horses frothing at the bit. They rode hard into town like a desert storm, scattering chickens and sending townsfolk scrambling for cover. Shouts rose in panic, doors slammed, windows shuttered. The leader, a hulking man with a battered hat and a voice like gravel, fired a shot into the air. "Nobody moves, and nobody gets hurt," he bellowed. "We're just collecting what's owed." Mercer, Silas thought darkly. This wasn't random. This was a message. Pressure to bend the town's will to that bastard's ambitions. Gunshots cracked. Glass shattered as bullets punched through storefront windows. Old Tom, the blacksmith, swung a hammer at a bandit dismounting near his shop, but the outlaw kicked him down, laughter echoing cruelly. Silas's hand hovered near his holster. He hadn't come to Dustwood to play hero. Revenge was his road, straight and narrow, yet as he caught sight of Rebecca, skirts gathered in her hands as she ushered a crying boy toward her clinic, something twisted hard in his chest. A bandit veered toward her, horse skidding to a halt. "Easy there, missy," the outlaw drawled, reaching down to grab her arm. "Boss said we take what we need and you'll do just fine." Rebecca yanked back, fear flashing across her face, but she stood firm, defiant. "Let go of me." Silas didn't think, didn't hesitate. One heartbeat he was still. The next his Colt was out, iron cold and familiar in his grip. He fired. The shot rang sharp and true, knocking the bandit clean off his horse with a grunt of surprise and pain. Chaos erupted. Another outlaw spun toward Silas, raising his rifle. Too slow. Silas shot again, bullets slamming into the man's shoulder, sending him sprawling. "Damn fool," Silas muttered under his breath, lunging forward. He reached Rebecca just as another bandit charged. Silas tackled her to the ground, shielding her with his body as a bullet whined overhead. "Stay down," he growled against her ear. "I'm not," she started, breath hitching. "Stay." Her eyes, wide, frightened, but burning with that same stubborn fire, met his. Then she nodded, pressing low behind the watering trough. Silas rolled to his feet, firing twice more. The third outlaw dropped his gun, cursing as he scrambled backward. Horses screamed. Dust thickened the air, stinging eyes and clogging lungs. Silas's blood pounded hot and fast, adrenaline a roaring tide in his veins. Movement to his right, he ducked just in time, fist swinging up to catch a bandit across the jaw. Bone crunched beneath his knuckles. Shots rang out from across the street. Caleb, the deputy, had finally joined the fray, rifle barking as he picked off outlaws from behind a barrel. Their eyes met across the chaos, a flash of understanding passing between them. No words needed, just survival. Just stopping this. Another outlaw rushed toward the mercantile, gun waving. Silas sprinted after him, boots pounding over packed dirt. He grabbed the man's shoulder, yanked him back, and drove a punch into his gut. The outlaw doubled over, wind gone, dropping his weapon. Pain flared in Silas's side, where stitches tugged and fresh wounds protested. But he gritted through it. No time for pain. No room for anything but grit and fire. Minutes stretched like hours until, one by one, the bandits either fled or lay moaning in the dirt. Hoofbeats receded, leaving Dustwood battered but standing. Silas stood amid the wreckage, chest heaving, smoke and dust swirling around him. Blood, some his, some not, spattered his shirt. His hand ached from punching, shooting, fighting. And Rebecca, damn her stubbornness, emerged from her hiding spot, skirts torn, hair askew, but eyes blazing. "You could have been killed," she said, voice sharp with fear and anger and something else tangled between the words. "Yeah," he rasped, rubbing at a split knuckle. "But you'd have been worse off if I hadn't." Her mouth opened, maybe to argue, but then her gaze softened, shoulders sagging. "Thank you," she murmured. He shrugged, glancing away. "Don't mention it." Around them, townsfolk began to creep from hiding, checking on neighbors, assessing damage. Caleb approached, hat in hand, face grim. "Mercer's behind this," he said flatly. "Sending a message." Silas' jaw tightened. "Yeah, I got it loud and clear." Rebecca placed a gentle hand on his arm, warmth seeping through fabric and skin. "This town's caught in the middle of something ugly," she whispered. "And now you are too." Silas glanced at her, at the smudges of dirt on her cheek, the worry in her eyes. He didn't say it, but she was right. Trouble had a way of sticking, and he was neck-deep in it now. He holstered his gun, shoulders heavy. The sun dipped lower, casting the world in deepening amber hues. Heat still clung to the air, but it wasn't the sun that made sweat bead at his brow. It was the weight of choices, of old wounds and new battles. The fight was over for now, but something told him this was just the beginning. Dustwood settled into uneasy silence after the battle, the air thick with the lingering scent of gunpowder and dust. Broken glass glittered across the street like scattered stars, and townsfolk moved quietly, their voices hushed with fear and exhaustion. But for Silas, the world narrowed to the burning pull in his side and the steady, guiding hand on his arm. "Lean on me," Rebecca said, her tone gentle but brooking no argument. Silas grunted, half-heartedly resisting. "I can walk." "You just fought off half a gang with stitches still fresh," she countered, glancing up at him. "Humor me." He wanted to argue, but his legs wobbled, the adrenaline that had kept him upright draining fast. With a sigh that tasted of blood and pride swallowed whole, he let her lead him back into the clinic. Inside, the warm glow of the lantern cast golden light over shelves lined with bottles and neatly folded linens. The door shut behind them, muffling the sounds of the town beyond. Rebecca guided him to the cot where he sat heavily, hissing as pain lanced through his side. "Shirt off," she ordered, already fetching a fresh basin of water. Silas shot her a look. "You're awful bossy for someone so small." Her lips twitched, half amusement, half exasperation. "And you're awful stubborn for someone bleeding all over my floor." Despite himself, a faint smile ghosted across his mouth. Still, he peeled off his shirt with a wince, revealing the angry red gash stitched along his ribs, freshly torn open during the fight. Blood smeared across his skin, a stark contrast to the bruises blooming purple and blue. Rebecca's breath hitched, but she said nothing. Her hands moved deftly, cleaning the wound with practiced care. The coolness of the water was a balm, but it was her touch, gentle yet firm, that settled something deep inside him. "Don't know why you bother," he muttered after a long stretch of silence. "Ain't like I'm worth the trouble." Her hands paused. "I decide who's worth the trouble," she said quietly. "And right now, you're a man who risks his life to protect people. That matters." He looked away, jaw tightening. "Didn't do it for them," he lied, though they both knew it wasn't the whole truth. Her fingers moved again, tracing the line of the wound with careful precision. "You could have walked away," she murmured, "but you didn't." Silas let out a breath, scrubbing a hand over his face. "Had a brother," he said suddenly, the words slipping out before he could catch them. Rebecca stilled but didn't interrupt. "Younger. Caleb was his friend, too. Kid always believed in doing right, no matter how hard. Guess he'd have wanted me to step in." Rebecca's gaze softened, her fingers stilling over his ribs. "What was his name?" "Caleb," he said, voice rough. "Same as Harrow. They grew up thick as thieves." A bitter smile pulled at his lips. World's got a funny sense of humor. She didn't speak for a moment, just smoothed a cool, damp cloth over his skin. Her touch was gentle, and something in her presence, the quiet acceptance, the warmth, chipped away at the walls he'd built. "You miss him," she said softly. Not a question, just truth laid bare between them. Silas swallowed hard, throat tightening. "Every damn day." Rebecca's hand slid from his wound to his shoulder, warm and solid. His gaze lifted, meeting hers, and something shifted in the space between them. The air thickened, charged with something electric and undeniable. Her eyes, flecked with gold and green, held his as if seeing straight through to the parts of him he thought long buried. He reached up, hesitated, then let his hand brush a stray lock of hair from her face. Her breath caught, lips parting just enough to stir the air between them. The distance closed, inch by careful inch. His gaze flicked to her mouth, soft, inviting, and for a heartbeat the world outside ceased to exist. His lips hovered a breath away from hers. Then Rebecca pulled back, blinking as if waking from a spell. Her cheeks flushed a delicate pink. I should finish bandaging you," she said, voice a touch too bright, too quick. Silas nodded, jaw tightening to mask the flicker of disappointment. "Yeah, right." Silence fell again. Heavier this time, thick with unspoken things. Rebecca worked in quiet efficiency, her touch careful but no longer lingering. When she stepped back at last, wiping her hands on her apron, he let out a breath. "Thanks," he muttered. Rebecca's gaze lifted, soft but guarded. "Get some rest, Silas. You've had enough fighting for one day." He nodded, watching as she turned toward the shelves. Part of him wanted to reach out again, but instead he pushed himself off the cot, moving toward the small mirror nailed crookedly to the wall. The cracked glass reflected a man he barely recognized. Face bruised, eyes shadowed with too many ghosts. But beneath the scars and grit something else flickered. Something dangerous, something hopeful, and that scared him more than any bullet ever could. Silas stared at his reflection, the fractured mirror splintering his image into shards, each one a piece of the man he was, the man he'd become, and the man he wasn't sure he wanted to be. Chapter 3: Unraveling Threads. The night stretched across the plains like a thick velvet blanket, stitched with stars that shimmered faintly against the darkness. A crescent moon hung low in the sky, casting silver streaks over the rolling hills and the sprawling estate that loomed ahead like a sleeping beast. Silas crouched behind a stand of mesquite trees, every muscle coiled tight as he surveyed the grand structure. Elias Mercer's estate was a far cry from the modest homes in Dustwood. The two-story ranch house stood proud, its whitewashed walls gleaming even in the dim light, a wraparound porch lined with ornate columns, a testament to Mercer's wealth and ego. Lanterns glowed warmly through lace-draped windows, the flickering light illuminating the lush landscaping that surrounded the home like a well-maintained fortress. Silas's lip curled. Fancy place for a man with blood on his hands. From his vantage point he watched as a carriage rolled up the long gravel drive, horses snorting as a liveried driver pulled them to a halt. The door swung open and Mercer stepped out. Tall, broad-shouldered, with salt and pepper hair slicked back beneath a black felt hat. His tailored suit spoke of money, the kind that didn't come clean in these parts. His polished boots gleamed as he strode toward the porch with the kind of confidence that came from knowing most folks either feared you or owed you, or both. Two men followed him, thugs in fine clothes, their guns holstered but eyes sharp. Mercer paused at the top of the steps, lit a cigar and exhaled a slow plume of smoke that curled into the cool night air. His lips twisted into a smile that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. Silas clenched his fists. There it was, that damn charm that had half the town fooled. Mercer could pour honeyed words over poison and folks would lap it up, blind to the venom underneath. The front door opened, spilling warm light onto the porch. Another man stepped out, Reed Maddox, the county land assessor. Silas's stomach turned at the sight of him. Maddox was a weasel in human form, with slick hair and a smile as slippery as his dealings. "You're late," Mercer's voice carried, smooth as aged whiskey but with an edge that cut sharp. "Had to be careful," Maddox replied, glancing around as if expecting shadows to sprout men with guns. "People are starting to whisper that Kane fella's back in town." Silas's jaw tightened. Mercer waved a hand dismissively. "Let him whisper. Words don't stop land deals." He took another drag from his cigar, exhaling thoughtfully. "The papers?" Maddox produced a leather satchel, extracting a bundle of documents. "Right here, deeds and claims, all signed, sealed, and creatively dated." Mercer chuckled, a low, dangerous sound. "You always were a resourceful bastard, Reed." Silas's pulse quickened. Forged claims. He edged closer, boots careful against the dry earth. Every word was a thread pulling the whole sordid picture into focus. Mercer wasn't just leaning on folks to sell their land. He was stealing it outright. With Maddox's help, he'd been fabricating deeds, making it all look legal on paper while shoving honest people out of their homes. "It'll push the railroad deal through?" Maddox asked, voice tight. Mercer nodded. "By the time anyone smells something foul, the tracks will be laid, the money in my pocket. Hell, folks will be too busy counting their compensation to care they've been swindled." Silas's stomach churned. Compensation? Meaning pennies on the dollar, if that? Families would be uprooted, livelihoods ruined, all for Mercer's greed. The men's laughter grated against the still night. Silas slipped back, muscles tense with the urge to storm in, to put a bullet between Mercer's smug eyes. But fury was a noose if you let it pull tight around your neck. He needed proof, something that would stick beyond a quick trigger pull. Another voice piped up, one of Mercer's guards. "What about Kane? He pokes around too much, could stir up a mess." Mercer's smile never faltered. "If Kane gets in the way—" He paused, taking a long draw from his cigar. "We'll handle it, one way or another." Silas's blood ran cold. There it was, the threat wrapped in velvet. And he didn't doubt for a second Mercer meant every word. "You'll have to try harder than that," Silas thought grimly. He backed away slowly, retreating into the cover of the trees. His heart pounded, anger simmering beneath his skin. The land deals, the raid on Dustwood, it was all part of a bigger scheme. Mercer didn't just want land, he wanted power, control. And he didn't care who trampled to get it. Silas's mind spun as he mounted his horse, easing the reins in his calloused hands. He had what he came for, a piece of the puzzle. But it wasn't enough, not yet. He needed those papers, proof that would damn Mercer in front of a judge, if there was a judge left who hadn't been bought off. The moonlight glinted off the barrel of his revolver, but tonight wasn't for guns. Tonight was for planning. Digging in his heels, he urged the mare into a quiet gallop, the wind tugging at his coat as he rode into the darkness. "You can hide behind charm and money all you want, Mercer," Silas thought, "but I'm coming for you." The ride back into Dustwood was a blur of darkness and simmering anger. Silas's horse snorted, hooves pounding against the hard-packed earth, but his mind ran faster, tangled with Mercer's smug face and those damnable papers sealing half the town's fate. By the time the warm glow of Rebecca's clinic came into view, his body ached from the ride, but that wasn't what had his chest tight. He swung down from the saddle, boots hitting the ground with a solid thud. The door creaked as he pushed inside. The familiar scent of herbs and wood smoke filled the room, a stark contrast to the storm brewing in his gut. Rebecca stood at the table, sorting bandages, her brow furrowed in concentration. Candlelight flickered over her features, casting soft shadows along her jawline. He should have waited, should have cooled the fire in his veins, but fury, hot and unrelenting, burned away reason. "I found out how Mercer's pulling it off," Silas said, voice rough with restrained anger. Rebecca glanced up, concern knitting her brow. "What did you—" "Forged claims," he cut in. "Land deeds, all fixed up nice and legal on paper. He's using that weasel Maddox to steal every damn acre he can." His jaw clenched. "Your town's being sold out from under it, piece by piece." Her lips parted in shock. That's awful." "Yeah," he bit out, pacing. "Families thrown off, land their kin settled. All so Mercer can fatten his pockets." His gaze slid back to her, sharp and searching. "And guess whose money's keeping that scheme running?" Rebecca stilled, color draining from her face. Her silence stretched a beat too long. Silas' stomach twisted. "Rebecca," her shoulders sagged as she set the bandage roll down, hands trembling slightly. "My father," she whispered, barely audible. "Before he passed, he invested in Mercer's ventures, said it was for the town's future." Silas stared at her, disbelief, betrayal, like a punch to the gut that left him breathless. "You knew!" "I didn't," she shook her head. "I didn't know what Mercer was planning. My father believed it was for the railroad, for progress." "Progress?" His laugh was harsh, cold. "Is that what you call burning folks out of their homes? Killing men like my brother?" Her eyes widened, pain flashing across her features. "I didn't know, Silas, if I had." "But you took his money," his voice rose, raw and bitter. "Lived in that house, bought with the same coin Mercer used to ruin us." "That's not fair," she shot back, voice shaking. "I was a child when those investments were made. I've tried to help this town, tried to make up for it. But it ain't enough." His hands curled into fists. "You stood there, nursing me back like some angel, all kindness and soft words, and all the while you—" He broke off, chest heaving. The room felt too small, suffocating. Tears welled in her eyes, but she held her ground. "I didn't betray you," she said, voice breaking. "I care about you. That right?" His gaze darkened, the weight of old wounds pressing down. "'Cause from where I'm standing, looks like you're just another piece of the same damn puzzle." Rebecca flinched as if he'd struck her. Silas turned away, raking a hand through his hair. Regret twisted beneath the anger, but it was too late. Words, once thrown, couldn't be caught. His boots scraped against the floor as he moved toward the door. "Silas!" He paused, jaw tight. "I trusted you," he said, voice low. "That's on me." And with that he yanked the door open. Cold night air rushed in, carrying the faint scent of rain. Rebecca's voice broke behind him. "Please, don't walk away like this." But he didn't stop. Couldn't. Not with anger clawing at his insides, burning hotter with every step. Outside the heavens opened, rain spilling down in heavy sheets. Silas swung into the saddle, water already soaking through his coat. The horse danced beneath him, sensing the storm in man and sky alike. He dug in his heels. The mare surged forward, hooves churning mud, rain pelting down so hard it blurred the world. He rode into the storm, fury burning hotter than the chill wind lashing his face. Lightning split the sky, and still Silas Kane rode. Away from betrayal, away from everything he wasn't ready to face. The rain swallowed him whole. The rain had turned the dirt roads into rivers of mud, each hoofbeat sending up wet splashes as Silas rode hard through the darkness. His coat clung to his back, heavy with water, but he didn't slow. Anger burned hotter than the cold rain, hotter than the ache in his chest or the weight of Rebecca's betrayal pressing down on him like a stone. Her face kept flashing in his mind, her eyes wide with hurt, her voice breaking with regret. But he shoved the memory away. Focus, he told himself. There was no room for softness, not now. Not when Mercer was out there, pulling the strings, tearing apart lives without blinking an eye. The rain lessened to a steady drizzle as Silas crested a ridge overlooking Mercer's sprawling estate. Lanterns glowed warm in the windows, the grand house standing proud amid the darkness. Like a vulture's roost, fat on the bones of those it had bled dry. He tethered his horse beneath a copse of trees, the mare snorting as he patted her flank. "Stay put," he murmured, voice lowered, and slipped a second pistol into his belt. His knife rested snug against his hip. One man, he thought, one bullet between him and justice. Mud sucked at his boots as he crept closer. The rain slicked everything, but Silas moved with practiced ease, slipping through shadows, every sense stretched taut. He could hear the faint murmur of voices from the porch. 2 guards laughing softly, unaware of the storm brewing beyond their lantern's glow. He waited until they turned, then struck, quick, silent, 2 sharp punches, bodies slumping into the mud. His pulse pounded. Every step now was a heartbeat closer to Mercer. The back door creaked open under his hand. Warmth and the faint scent of cigar smoke wafted out. Silas slipped inside, boots leaving wet prints on polished wood floors. His gaze darted to the staircase. Upstairs. Mercer's office, where the deals were made, where blood money changed hands. He moved swiftly, gun drawn. Candlelight flickered down the hall, casting long shadows. Voices echoed, a conversation that stilled as he pushed the door open with his shoulder. Elias Mercer sat behind a mahogany desk, the room rich with leather-bound books and expensive brandy. His silver hair gleamed in the soft light, that same smirk curling his lips. "Well," Mercer drawled, leaning back in his chair, "if it isn't Kane. Took you longer than I figured." Silas leveled his gun. "End of the road, Mercer." Mercer's gaze didn't waver. "You think you're the first man to point a gun at me? Go on, then." He spread his hands. "Pull the trigger. Won't stop what's coming." Silas's finger tightened. But something was wrong. Too easy. Too... Click. The cold press of a revolver against the back of his head. "Drop it," a voice growled. Silas cursed under his breath, but let the gun fall. His heart pounded, blood roaring in his ears. How the hell had he missed? Mercer stood, smoothing his waistcoat. "You really thought you could stroll in here alone?" "Can't say I'm not flattered by the guts, son." Silas swung his elbow back, catching the man behind him. Pain exploded as fists rained down. 3 men now, maybe more. He fought hard. He always fought hard. But boots connected with his ribs. A punch split his lips, stars dancing behind his eyes. "Hold him," Mercer snapped. "Wants him to hear this?" Silas's knees hit the floor, arms pinned. His chest heaved, blood trickling from his mouth. "You think killing me changes anything?" Mercer crouched down, voice like silk over steel. "You're a gnat buzzing in my ear, Kane. Swat you down, I still get my railroad." My money, and when Dustwood rolls over, I'll be right there counting every damn coin." Silas glared, every breath burning like fire in his lungs. "You're gonna fall," he rasped. "Folks'll see through you." Mercer chuckled. "By the time they do, I'll be long gone, richer than you can dream." Pain flared again, another punch sharp and merciless, the edges of Silas' world blurred. "Take him out back," Mercer said, standing. "Leave him for the coyotes." Rough hands dragged him, boots scraping against floorboards, then gravel. Rain hit his face, cold, sharp. The world tilted, darkness pressing in. He struggled. God, he fought, but the blows kept coming. Then nothing. Mud embraced him, cold and wet. Rain poured down, soaking blood into the earth. His last thought before darkness swallowed him whole wasn't of Mercer. It was of Rebecca's voice, soft, fierce, echoing in his ears. "Not everyone's out to hurt you." But maybe he'd been wrong to believe that. Lightning split the sky, and Silas Kane lay still. Chapter 4, Redemption's Edge. The air was thick with the promise of violence. Clouds rolled heavy and dark overhead, blotting out the stars and casting Mercer's estate in a gloom that felt fitting for what was about to unfold. The land stretched quiet before them, a hush that belied the chaos soon to come. Silas crouched behind a rocky outcrop with Caleb beside him, the scent of wet earth mingling with the faint tang of gun oil. His ribs still ached from the beating, bruises spreading like angry shadows across his skin, but pain didn't matter now. Not with Rebecca trapped inside that house. Not with Mercer holding her like some twisted bargaining chip. Caleb adjusted the brim of his hat, his gaze locked on the distant glow of lanterns lining the estate's porch. Guards paced like restless wolves. "You sure about this?" Caleb's voice was low, edged with tension. "Don't reckon I have much choice," Silas muttered, checking his revolver one last time. "He's got her." Caleb sighed, rubbing the back of his neck. "This is crazy." Silas shot him a look. "Didn't come here for a lecture, Harrow. No, you came here to get yourself killed," Caleb shot back, then softer. "But hell, guess I can't let you do it alone." A faint smile tugged at Silas's mouth, gone as quick as it came. "Wouldn't expect any less." They exchanged a nod. Old wounds set aside, at least for tonight. Caleb pulled out a pocket watch, the ticking loud in the stillness. "Gods switch rounds every 10 minutes. We time it right, we get to the back door before they circle back. And if we don't?" Caleb shrugged. "We shoot faster?" Silas's grin was grim. "Sounds about right." With hearts pounding in tandem, they moved. Boots softened by mud, breaths held tight, every step measured against the risk of discovery. Silas's gaze flicked to the upper window, Rebecca's window. Light flickered beyond the glass. His jaw clenched. "Hold on," he thought. "I'm coming." They reached the back entrance just as a guard rounded the corner. The man's eyes widened, mouth opening to shout, too late. Silas' fist connected with his jaw, sending him sprawling into the mud. Caleb dragged the unconscious body aside, and Silas eased the door open. Inside, warmth and the rich scent of cigar smoke drifted through the halls. The house was a maze of polished wood floors and expensive furnishings, but Silas saw none of it. His focus was singular. Rebecca. A shout rang out upstairs. "Damn, so much for quiet." "Guess we're doing this loud," Caleb muttered, drawing his revolver. Silas didn't answer. He was already moving. Boots pounded up the stairs, gun drawn. Shouts echoed, footsteps charging toward them. The first guard appeared at the landing. Silas fired. Clean shot to the shoulder, dropping the man. Another came from the left. Caleb took him down, bullet ricocheting off the banister. "Go!" Caleb barked. "I'll hold him." Silas didn't hesitate. He sprinted down the hall, heart a wild drumbeat in his chest. The door to Rebecca's room loomed ahead. Locked. He kicked it open. Rebecca spun around, her face pale but fierce. Her wrists were bound, hair tousled, a bruise blooming along her cheekbone. Her eyes widened. "Silas! Hold still!" He cut the ropes with his knife, hand surprisingly gentle. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, fear and relief warring in her gaze. "Too late for that," he muttered. "Come on." But footsteps thundered closer. Mercer's voice boomed down the hall. "Kane, you're making a mistake, boy." Silas's grip tightened around Rebecca's arm. "Heard that before." They bolted from the room, gunfire erupting as Mercer's men rounded the corner. Bullets shattered vases, tore through wallpaper. Silas shoved Rebecca ahead of him, shielding her as best he could. Caleb reappeared, breathless. "Front door's blocked." "Kitchen," Silas said. "Leads out back." They ran, feet slipping on polished floors slick with mud. Rebecca stumbled, but Silas caught her, his hand warm and solid against hers. "Almost there," he promised. A guard lunged at them in the kitchen doorway. Silas fired point blank, smoke and heat filling the air. They burst outside into the night air, lungs burning. Bullets chased them across the lawn. Caleb returned fire, covering their retreat. "Horses!" Silas barked. They reached the hitching post. Silas swung Rebecca into the saddle of his mare, mounting behind her. Caleb leapt onto his horse. "Go!" Caleb shouted. They kicked off, hooves thundering, mud flying. Mercer's men gave chase, gunfire cracking, but the darkness swallowed them whole. Silas's arms tightened around Rebecca as the wind tore past. Her heartbeat pounded against his chest. "You came for me," she whispered. "Damn right I did," he rasped. And they rode into the night, chaos behind them, redemption just out of reach. Darkness stretched across the wilderness, heavy with rain-soaked earth and the distant, mournful howl of a coyote. Silas lay motionless on the cold ground, blood seeping into the mud beneath him, breath coming in shallow gasps. The world blurred around the edges, darkness pulling at him like a relentless tide. His body ached, a collection of bruises, broken ribs, and a head that felt like it had been split open. Somewhere in the distance, hoofbeats approached, slow at first, cautious, then faster. A voice cut through the haze, low, gruff, familiar. "Damn fool," Caleb muttered, reining in his horse. He swung down, boots splashing in the mud as he crouched beside Silas. "Could have just walked away, but no, you had to go play hero." Silas tried to speak, but pain clawed through him, stealing the words. Caleb's gaze softened, just a fraction. "Revenge is going to bury you, Cain," he said, voice quieter now. "Hell, nearly did." He paused, glancing at the bruised mess Silas had become. "You're a stubborn bastard, I'll give you that." Strong arms hooked under Silas's shoulders, hauling him up with a grunt. "Come on, you ain't dying out here, not tonight." Pain flared bright and hot as Caleb half-dragged, half-carried him toward the horse. Silas clenched his jaw, biting back a groan. The rain had eased to a cold drizzle, soaking them both to the bone. Caleb muttered curses under his breath, his frustration tempered with something that might have been worry. "You just had to go after Mercer alone," Caleb said, maneuvering Silas onto the saddle. "Could have asked for help, but no, pride's thicker than your damn skull." Silas managed a rasp. "Wasn't your fight." "It is now." Caleb swung up behind him, steadying the reins. "Always was, just took you being half dead to remember that." The ride was a blur of pain and shifting darkness. Silas drifted in and out, the steady rhythm of hoofbeats and Caleb's grumbled reassurances keeping him tethered to consciousness. "You hang on, hear me?" Caleb muttered. "I ain't dragging your sorry hide back to town just for you to quit on me." And somehow, against the weight of exhaustion and pain, Silas held on. Back in Dustwood, Rebecca paced the small confines of her clinic, heart pounding with restless worry. Her hands twisted the edge of her apron, mind a whirlwind of fear and guilt. "This is my fault." The thought gnawed at her, relentless. Silas had gone after Mercer alone, because of her, because of what her father's investments had wrought. Her chest tightened, breath hitching. She'd tried to stay detached, to do what was right without getting entangled, but somewhere along the way, lines had blurred. Her heart hadn't listened to reason. She glanced toward the door, hoping, praying, that Caleb would return with Silas in tow. Safe, alive. But waiting wasn't enough, not anymore. Her jaw set. If Mercer thinks he can tear this town apart, if he thinks he can hurt people she cares about. She shed her apron, pulling on a cloak against the chill night air. Gathering a small satchel, she tucked a dagger inside, just in case. Her pulse quickened with nerves, but she pushed them down. This wasn't about bravery, it was about doing what needed to be done. The streets were quiet as she slipped through the shadows, her boots soft against the muddy ground. Lanterns flickered weakly in the wind, casting long, stretched shadows. Mercer's estate loomed ahead, its grandeur mocking in the darkness. Rebecca crept to the side entrance, the one the servants used. She'd treated a maid here once, and the woman had mentioned the door's faulty latch. Heart-pounding, she eased it open. The house smelled of cigars and expensive cologne, layered with something darker. Greed, corruption. Her footsteps were quick and light on the polished floors. Upstairs, his office. That's where the truth would be. The door creaked as she slipped inside, breath catching at the opulence. Dark wood paneling, a massive desk cluttered with ledgers, a decanter half filled with amber liquid. She hurried to the drawers, fingers trembling as she rifled through papers, deeds, names. Her stomach churned at the list of properties taken, lies and threats. And there, stamped and signed, was Dustwood's fate, sealed in ink and blood. Tears pricked her eyes. He was right. Silas was right. A floorboard creaked behind her. She froze. Slowly, heart hammering, she turned. Mercer stood in the doorway, a pistol resting casually in his hand. His smile didn't reach his eyes. Well, well, look what we got here. Rebecca's throat went dry. You can't get away with this, sweetheart, he drawled, stepping inside. I already have. She clutched the papers, backing toward the window. But a guard appeared there, blocking the exit. Mercer's gaze hardened. Thought you were smarter than this, Miss Whitfield. Shame. The room seemed to shrink around her, choices narrowing to none. Silas? Miles away, Silas stirred on the cot in Rebecca's clinic, drenched in sweat, breath catching in his chest. Voices echoed in his fogged mind. Hers, pleading. Mercer's laughter, cold and cruel. His eyes snapped open, guilt twisted deep, urgency, hot and fierce, surged through him. Rebecca, he rasped, heart-pounding. She was in danger, and he was already too damn late. The storm clouds churned overhead, casting the land in a bruised gray hue. Thunder rumbled in the distance, a low growl echoing the tension thick in the air. Silas Kane rode hard, the wind lashing at his coat, the horse's hooves thundering across the open plain toward Mercer's estate. His ribs burned with every jolt, his bruised body protesting with each movement, but he pressed on, heart pounding with a single thought. Rebecca. He'd been too late before. He wouldn't be this time. The estate loomed ahead, grand, sprawling, and lit with the glow of lanterns that painted golden pools across the rain-slicked ground. Silas dismounted, boots splashing in the mud, and drew his revolver. Every step toward the house was a heartbeat closer to reckoning. The door swung open before he reached it. Mercer stepped out onto the porch, dressed impeccably as always. Dark suit, cravat knotted just so, and that damnable smirk twisting his lips. Behind him, 2 armed men flanked the door, rifles ready. "Well," Mercer drawled, taking a drag from his cigar, "look what the cat dragged back. Figured you'd be dead by now." Silas didn't respond with words. His revolver lifted, steady despite the shaking in his bones. "Where is she?" His voice was a growl, rough and edged with fury. Mercer chuckled. "You've got stones, Kane, I'll give you that. Comin' here alone." "I ain't askin' again." A door creaked behind Mercer. Rebecca was shoved into view, arms bound, hair tousled, a smear of dirt across her cheek. Her eyes found Silas instantly, wide, frightened, and fierce all at once. "Silas," she breathed, his jaw clenched. "Let her go." "Now why would I do that?" Mercer flicked ash from his cigar. "You've been a thorn in my side long enough. Thought a good beatin' would teach you manners, but some folks just don't learn." He smiled, teeth flashing. "So here we are. One last dance." Rebecca twisted in her captor's grasp. "You don't have to do this," she snapped at Mercer. "Oh, but I do, sweetheart." Mercer's gaze flicked back to Silas. "See, men like us, we settle things the old-fashioned way." Silas stepped forward, mud sucking at his boots. "This ain't about land anymore," he said, voice low. "It's about you thinking you can take what ain't yours and get away with it." Mercer's smile thinned. "Funny. I was about to say the same thing." Tension coiled, thick and suffocating. The rain began to fall in earnest, fat drops pattering against wood and earth. Silas' finger tightened on the trigger, every nerve stretched taut. Then Rebecca's voice cutting through the storm and fury. "Silas," she pleaded, her eyes locking with his, "don't let him take the rest of you. Don't let your hate be what's left." The words hit harder than any bullet. His breath caught, the anger that had fueled him flickering, wavering. He wanted vengeance. God, he burned for it. But Rebecca, she was right. He'd lost so much already. If he crossed that line, there might be no coming back. Mercer saw the hesitation and sneered. "That's your weakness, Cain. Always was." Then, so fast it barely registered, Mercer's hand darted to his coat. "No!" Rebecca lunged. The world exploded in a flash of movement and sound. Silas fired, but Mercer had already drawn, and the crack of a gunshot split the air. A scream, Rebecca's. Time slowed. Rebecca staggered, eyes wide in shock, a bloom of red spreading across the bodice of her dress. Her knees buckled. "Rebecca!" Silas' voice shattered, raw and panicked as he caught her, lowering her gently to the muddy ground. Her blood was warm against his hands, seeping through her dress, staining his fingers red. Tears blurred his vision. "Stay with me," he rasped, voice breaking. "Come on, darling, stay with me." Her lips trembled, trying to form words. Her hand found his, fingers weak but grasping. "Had to. Couldn't let him." "Shh." His tears mingled with the rain, dripping onto her face. "Don't talk. Just hold on." Mercer's boots creaked nearby, but Silas didn't hear him, not over the roaring in his ears, the world narrowing to Rebecca's face, pale and beautiful even in pain. Please God, he thought, heart splintering. Not her, anyone but her. And as the rain poured, washing the blood into the earth, Silas cradled her close, his shield, his anchor, knowing the fight wasn't over. But if he lost her, he didn't know if he had any fight left at all. Chapter 5. Love's Reckoning. The rain had slackened to a misty drizzle, the storm's fury spent but leaving behind a world soaked and shivering. Silas knelt in the mud, cradling Rebecca in his arms, his heart pounding in frantic, uneven beats. Her breath came in shallow gasps, her face pale, lips trembling as she clung to him with what little strength she had left. "Stay with me, darlin'," he whispered, voice rough with emotion. His thumb brushed a damp lock of hair from her cheek. "Just hold on." Her eyes fluttered open, hazel gaze locking with his. There was pain there, God, so much pain, but also warmth, love. Even now she was the calm to his storm. Her fingers tightened on his arm. "Silas, don't—" Her voice cracked, barely audible. "Don't let him take the rest of you." Her words, spoken with such quiet conviction, struck him harder than any bullet ever could. Don't let him take the rest of you. For months, no, years, his life had been narrowed down to one purpose: vengeance. Elias Mercer had stolen his family, his future. Tonight was supposed to be the end of it, the final act of a bloody play. Kill Mercer, end it. But as he looked at Rebecca, blood seeping through her dress, her hand still clutching his as if he were the one in need of saving, Silas felt the anger that had fueled him begin to fracture. Vengeance had brought him to this point, but it wouldn't bring her back if she slipped away. It wouldn't heal the gaping wounds inside him. Slowly, Silas shifted, laying Rebecca gently on the ground. His coat came off in one swift motion placed under her head. "I'll be right back," he promised, voice a gruff whisper. Just hold on." Then he rose. Elias Mercer stood a few yards away, revolver in hand, expression a mixture of smug satisfaction and barely concealed panic. "Could have ended this, Cain," Mercer sneered, raising his weapon. "Now you're just gonna—" Silas didn't let him finish. With a snarl, he lunged forward, knocking the revolver aside. Mercer fired, the shot going wide, and then Silas's fist connected with his jaw. Mercer staggered back, boots slipping in the mud. "You shot her," Silas growled, rage burning anew. His fists clenched. He could end it now, just a squeeze of the trigger. One pull. Mercer's blood for Rebecca's, for Caleb's, for everyone this man had wronged. Mercer hit the ground hard, mud splattering across his fine suit. He looked up, breathing heavy, eyes wild. "Go ahead," he spat. "Do it. You ain't got the guts." Silas stood over him, revolver aimed square at Mercer's chest. His finger tightened. God, it'd be so easy. Justice and revenge, one and the same. Wasn't that what he'd always believed? But then, Rebecca's voice, soft but unwavering, echoed in his mind. Don't let him take the rest of you. He closed his eyes for half a heartbeat, breathed, and lowered the gun. Mercer blinked, confusion twisting his features. What? You ain't worth it, Silas said quietly. Killin' you wouldn't fix nothin', and she— He glanced back at Rebecca, lying in the mud, her gaze still on him, trusting him. She's right. I ain't letting you drag me down to your level, Mercer laughed, bitter and scornful. You think letting me live makes you better? No, Silas replied, but it makes me free. Behind him, hoofbeats approached fast. Caleb rode into view, rifle drawn, face grim. Mercer, he barked, dismounting, you're under arrest. Mercer's eyes darted between them, disbelief settling in. You got no proof. Oh, I think we do, Caleb shot back, pulling a bundle of papers from his coat, the documents Rebecca had risked everything to get. Forgery, fraud, whole list of charges long enough to hang you twice. Mercer's smugness crumbled. Guards arrived, disarmed him, and Caleb snapped on a pair of iron cuffs. Silas turned away, heart pounding for a different reason now. He dropped to his knees beside Rebecca. Her eyelids fluttered, a faint smile tugging at her lips. You didn't kill him, she whispered. No, Silas murmured, brushing mud and rain from her cheek. Because you were right. His voice cracked. You saved me, darlin', when I didn't think there was anything left to save. Her hand found his, squeezing weakly. Always knew you were more than anger. His throat tightened. Hold on, sweetheart. We'll get you patched up. Just stay with me, please. The rain eased, moonlight breaking through the clouds, casting a soft glow over them. Silas cradled her close, her warmth mingling with his tears. Justice had been served, but none of it mattered. Not the revenge, not the fight. If she slipped away now, please, God, he thought, holding her tight, don't take her from me. And in that moment, kneeling in the mud with her blood staining his hands, Silas Kane knew what it meant to be truly afraid. The faint morning light crept across the horizon, soft and golden, casting long shadows over the muddy ground that had, hours before, been soaked with blood and rain. The storm had passed, leaving the air crisp and smelling faintly of wet earth and honeysuckle. Life, it seemed, always found a way to emerge from the wreckage. Silas Kane sat on the edge of the cot in Rebecca's clinic, elbows resting on his knees, head bowed. His shirt was still stained with her blood, dried and dark against the fabric, but he hadn't changed. Couldn't, not yet. His world had narrowed to the steady rise and fall of her chest on the bed beside him, the fragile proof that she was still here, still breathing. Rebecca lay pale against the crisp white sheets, her face softened by the morning's glow. Bandages wrapped her shoulder where Mercer's bullet had torn through, the wound shallow enough, the doctor had said, to miss anything vital. Silas had barely breathed until he'd heard those words. His hand drifted to hers, fingers curling gently around her smaller, cooler ones. You scared the hell out of me, he murmured, a voice rough with exhaustion and something deeper, something raw. His thumb brushed across her knuckles, calloused skin against delicate fingers. Reckon that's not something I'm used to, caring like this. He swallowed hard, gaze fixed on her face. Didn't think I had it in me. Thought, after Caleb, after everything, there wasn't nothing left but anger. His voice dropped to a whisper. Then you came along, storming into my life with that stubborn heart of yours. And damned if you didn't tear down every wall I built. Rebecca stirred, lashes fluttering before her eyes opened, hazel depths meeting his. Tired, yes, but warm. So damn warm. You came for me, she whispered, voice rasped from pain and sleep. Course I did. His lips curved into a faint, tender smile. Couldn't let you go running off, saving me all on your own. Her fingers squeezed his weakly, but the smile she gave was pure sunshine. Always knew there was a good man under all that gruffness. Silas's chest tightened. Damn woman always saw more in him than he ever could. He drew in a breath, the words catching in his throat before he forced them out. I love you, Rebecca. His gaze didn't waver. Didn't shy away from the weight of that truth. Didn't know it, didn't want to know it at first, but I do. You're the reason I ain't lost to that darkness. Tears welled in her eyes, sliding down her cheeks. I love you too, she whispered, her voice breaking with emotion. Silas leaned forward, pressing a tender kiss to her forehead, his rough hand cupping her face. Reckon I'll spend the rest of my life, then, kin God you're as stubborn as you are. The door creaked softly behind them. Silas turned to see Caleb standing in the doorway, hat in hand, eyes shadowed with something that twisted at Silas's heart. Regret, longing, and acceptance. Caleb's gaze flicked between them before he cleared his throat. Just came to check in, he said gruffly. Doc says she'll pull through. Tough as nails, this one. Rebecca smiled faintly. Takes one to know one. Silas met Caleb's gaze, old memories and newer wounds lingering in the silence between them. Thank you, he said quietly, for helping me save her. Caleb shrugged, lips tugging into a half-smile. Figured I owed you at least that much. His gaze lingered on Rebecca a beat longer before he sighed, slipping his hat back on. Guess some things ain't meant to be. Rebecca's face softened. Caleb, he held up a hand. No need. Wasn't meant for us. Wasn't your fault. His eyes found Silas's. Take care of her, Cain. She's worth more than any man deserves. Silas nodded, the weight of that trust settling heavy, but right, on his shoulder. I will. Caleb glanced away, jaw tight, then tipped his hat. Duty calls. Town ain't gonna rebuild itself. With that, he turned and strode out, boots echoing softly on the wooden floor. Rebecca sighed, tears lingering in her eyes. He deserves happiness. Silas brushed a thumb across her cheek. He'll find it. Man like him, he'll figure his way. Outside, the town stirred to life. Hammers rang out as folks repaired broken windows, patched roofs, and swept away the remnants of the storm. Children laughed, chasing each other through puddles. The saloon's battered sign creaked in the breeze, but it still swung strong. Dustwood, like its people, was bent but not broken. Silas glanced toward the window, the morning light casting a hopeful glow across the room. Looks like the world keeps spinning, he murmured. Rebecca smiled, eyes closing as she rested her head against his hand. Good, means we've still got time, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Silas believed it. Outside, Dustwood began to rebuild. Timbers raised anew, hearts healing as laughter replaced gunfire. Spring buds pushed through churned soil, new life blossoming from old wounds. And inside a small clinic, love, scarred but steadfast, grew stronger with every passing breath. The warm glow of late afternoon sunshine bathed the town of Dustwood in soft amber hues, the kind of light that made the world feel gentler, as if all the rough edges had been smoothed away. The air was thick with the scent of fresh-cut lumber, blooming wildflowers, and a hint of sawdust, a sure sign of hard work and new beginnings. Silas Cain stood near the frame of the newly expanded clinic, sleeves rolled to his elbows, sweat glistening on his brow. His calloused hands, once known for the quick draw of a gun, now held a hammer, the familiar weight in his grip carrying an entirely different purpose. He drove the nail in with practiced ease, stepping back to admire the progress. The clinic, once a modest single-room space, was now blossoming into a proper building, a sanctuary where folks could come for healing, not hurt. Rebecca's dream. Their dream now. He glanced over his shoulder to where she stood a few yards away, her skirts swaying gently in the breeze, arms wrapped around a ledger she'd been using to keep track of supplies. Her laughter carried across the yard, soft and sweet as she spoke with young Tommy Wren, who offered to help after school let out. The boy beamed under her attention, pride swelling in his chest as she praised his efforts. Silas's lips curled into a small, contented smile. Yeah, he thought, this is what it's supposed to feel like. Not so long ago, his world had been filled with darkness and anger, a life measured in bullets and the weight of revenge. Now, his days were measured by the swing of a hammer, the warmth of Rebecca's touch, the laughter that echoed from the townsfolk he'd once kept at arm's length. He wiped his brow with the back of his hand as Caleb approached, hands shoved into his pockets, grinning. "Place is looking good," the deputy said. "Never figured I'd see the day you traded bullets for nails." Silas chuckled. "Guess miracles happen." "Rebecca's rubbed off on you," Caleb added, his smile tinged with something bittersweet, but the warmth in his gaze was genuine. "She's good for you." Silas nodded, gaze drifting back to her. "Yeah, she is." Caleb clapped him on the shoulder. "Town's lucky to have you both." With that he tipped his hat and wandered off, duty calling. Silas watched him go, gratitude stirring in his chest. Bridges mended, wounds healing. Not everything was perfect, but damn if it wasn't close enough. As the sun began its slow descent, casting long golden beams across the land, Silas set the hammer aside. "That's enough for today," he murmured to himself. His body ached in ways that reminded him he wasn't as young as he used to be, but it was a good kind of ache, the kind earned from honest work and a heart finally at peace. He walked toward Rebecca, her gaze lifting to meet his as he approached. "You've been at it all day," she said, smiling. "You should rest." "Reckon I will," he drawled, taking her hand in his. Her fingers fit perfectly against his, soft and sure. "But not before we catch the sunset." Her eyes lit up with warmth as he led her to the edge of the porch they'd built just days before. The boards creaked beneath their boots, but they held strong. A foundation, much like what they were building together. They sat side by side, the sky stretched out before them in a canvas of oranges, pinks, and purples. The sun melted into the horizon, casting everything in a warm, honeyed glow. Rebecca rested her head against Silas's shoulder, her breath a gentle sigh against his neck. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "Yeah," he murmured, though his gaze lingered on her more than the sky. The way the light danced across her face, how her hair caught the breeze. It was a sight he knew he'd never tire of. For a while neither of them spoke, letting the world settle around them in peaceful quiet. Birds chirped their final songs of the day, and somewhere in the distance, someone's laughter floated on the wind. Life, vibrant and real. Then, breaking the silence, Silas's voice rumbled low. "Turns out," he said softly, "vengeance was never what I needed." Rebecca tilted her head to look up at him, eyes searching his. His gaze held hers, steady and filled with something deep and unwavering. "You were." Emotion welled up in her gaze, shimmering like the golden horizon. "Silas?" He leaned in, his lips brushing hers in a tender kiss. Soft, reverent, filled with promises unspoken but deeply felt. When they parted, she smiled through her tears. "You have my heart, Silas Kane. And you've got mine," he whispered back. "Always." The sun dipped lower, casting them in twilight's embrace. Tomorrow would bring more work, more rebuilding. There would be hard days, laughter, maybe even more scars along the way. But tonight, here, now, it was enough to sit hand in hand, hearts finally whole, as the world around them whispered promises of new beginnings and love that had weathered every storm. And as the stars began to prick the darkening sky, Silas Kane, once a man driven by ghosts, found peace. Not in the absence of his past, but in the warmth of the woman beside him and the quiet, steadfast beating of hope reborn. Thank you for listening.